the two types of energy production and eventually will be equivalent. Another issue that comes up is that the land that's most suitable for siting wind and solar is also most suitable often for agriculture. And that comes up in housing development and other types of issues. It certainly comes up with renewable energy. It's often easier to use that flat, well, in West Virginia, I shouldn't say flat, but relatively flat, and it's cleared land, and it's really ready for wind and solar as opposed to some other lands. And so what that means is that often farmers who can get much higher rents for wind and solar often, they are competing for, I want to plant crops or something of that nature. Well, I have to compete with the rental rates for solar and wind, which are much higher. And so if you look at the Census of Agriculture, the number of farms with solar systems and wind systems has grown exponentially over the past 20 years. And it looks like that growth is going to continue. And again, we see this in Maryland, for example, to lease cropland, it's between $25 and $175 per acre. But a solar company will offer $800 to $1,200 per acre. So that competition for land is an issue. On the other hand, some of these small farms are struggling to survive and are not profitable in many instances. So the opportunity to lease some of the land on the farm for solar or wind can offer the opportunity for that farm to continue. Whereas without that income from the wind and solar, that land might be converted to residential development or other types of uses. One theme that I think you're going to hear us talking about throughout the webinar today is prime farmland soils. And that comes up often as which farms should we protect? How should we target this? And often we're seeing that if you think about it, you perhaps should focus on preserving those prime farmland soils, or if you're in a state like West Virginia, or even if you're not in the Midwest where they have a lot of prime farmland soils, you might look at soils of local or state significance and try to preserve those. So now I'm going to turn it over to Whitney, who's going to talk about that unique situation where people support renewable energy, but maybe not if it's in their backyard.
Thank you, Jesse. So naturally, there are a lot of strong opinions at play with siting renewables on ag lands. Despite the strong support for renewable energy, especially relative to public support for fossil fuel or nuclear energy development, 89% of citizens favor expanding solar and 83% approve of wind power expansion. But despite this level of support, generally, you can imagine the attitudes change as soon as the field of solar panels or wind turbines is going in next door. So for planning purposes, NIMBYism, that is not in my backyard, attitudes are strong when it comes to placing renewables on ag lands. Jesse, can you go back to the presentation? Thanks. For context, on one hand, many think of ag lands as being beautiful, undeveloped countryside. And so the thought of development along the lines of large scale renewables seems like a stark contrast. And land use planning, even when we talk about use intensity, we often place rural ag conservation on the low end of intensity end of development, with increasing intensity towards like single family, multifamily, multi-use commercial, and so on. But in truth, agricultural practices can be very intensive in terms of noise, dust, smells, and other use impacts. And so the development intensity for planning purposes of renewable facilities on ag lands may not actually be all that far off from some of the more intensive industrial or common agricultural practices already taking place. By way of example, a commercial chicken house can measure from 20,000 square feet up to 40,000 square feet. Or even a more simple example, the noise decibel level generated from a wind turbine approximates the noise generated by a combine, the large machine that's used to harvest grain crops. So local, there's, the noise and impact aspect of, and related impact aspect of renewables, but then there's also local opposition directed towards effects on property values, resulting from a change in the landscape. And this seems to be primarily aesthetic in concern. Basically, the horizon looks different with wind turbines, or the landscape looks different with a field of solar panels versus vegetative crop. And then another source of local opposition can be the adverse environmental impacts of renewable facilities, particularly various harms to wildlife, like migratory bird patterns. Let's see. Next slide, please, Jesse. Thanks. Also in the background are a number of competing policy interests. So at the state level, many states simultaneously have policies to both promote renewables and preserve farmland, but very few states take into account when these interests come head to head. Basically, renewables attempting to site on ag lands. And often the competing policies can actually be found side by side in a state's zoning enabling authority. And this was the subject of, or the primary original research conducted as part of the paper that we referenced earlier, just to get a sense of how much states are anticipating this clash. There's also tension between whether siting renewables should be handled by state versus local regulation. Right now, siting authority varies widely across the country. About half of states leave siting renewables up to local governments, but some states place siting decisions entirely with state regulators. And even where siting decisions are left to local government, some states limit the ability to ban renewables altogether or limit what aspects of renewables can be regulated. So local zoning authority, to the extent it's available, is going to be a key tool to mitigating concerns associated with bringing renewables into a community on ag lands. And Jesse's going to provide more detail on that shortly. One interesting tidbit, earlier this year in West Virginia, we had a bill proposed but not passed that would have removed virtually all local authority to affect the siting of renewables. So there's a lot in the background. Next slide, Jesse. But to bring some optimism to the presentation, I'm excited to shift gears to co-location. Co-location is the dual use of land for both agricultural purposes and renewable energy siting. In other words, rather than compete for the same land, ag practices and renewable energy facilities can actually coexist. And this is a really exciting area of research. Co-location or dual use deliberately locates ag, most often within wind or solar installations. So that'll be my focus. In terms of wind co-location, wind turbines can fit into an agricultural landscape with little disruption or displacement of the agricultural activities around them. So they co-locate relatively, ag co-locates relatively easily with wind. Meanwhile, solar co-location, otherwise referred to as agrovoltaics, is a little trickier. Agrovoltaics is an evolving area of research that involves raising, spacing, orienting, or even specially designing solar panels to allow either ag production or ag conservation practices around and beneath the solar panels. And co-location has a lot of strengths. So like I said, it reduces land competition. It actually can increase land productivity overall. It can affect the social acceptance of utility scale renewable energy. So back to that NIMBYism, because the co-location projects are often viewed as projects with personality and a little bit more digestible to the surrounding community that's affected. Co-location provides additional and dependable revenue to farmers, helping to protect farms and keep food costs down. Jesse talked about the financial security that can be derived from using a portion of farmland for renewables, but co-location obviously achieves the same. It also provides a number of mutual benefits to crops, livestock, and the solar panels themselves. And I'll get into some more details through examples here shortly on what those mutual benefits look like. But before I do that, some of the challenges facing co-location are that there's a need to modify solar technologies to accommodate co-location, and that there's some uncertain market potential, whether renewable energy companies are interested in the collaboration necessary to make this work with farmers, and vice versa. There's a lot of working together that needs to be done for this to be successful. There's also some concerns over the effects on soil during the installation process, because particularly the soil compaction that occurs with installing renewables. And then some animals co-locate better than others. If you notice, the goats in the bottom right corner having a little too much fun on those solar panels. Anyway, as I said, in terms of wind co-location feasibility, wind and ag co-locate very easily, but the solar feasibility is a little more complicated. So to begin, while the methods of panel installation can enable a variety of activities under and around the solar panels, installation or design of solar panels has to be modified to make it work. So the panels can be raised even high enough such that large farming equipment can maneuver beneath and around, but then the beams holding the panels have to be buried much deeper. Panels can be spaced apart in ways that better allow crop production, but then the density of panels is lessened as a result. Panels can be installed such that they create a canopy above sensitive crops, or to provide the right environment for crops that actually prefer partial sun. I've even seen panels oriented vertically or perpendicular to the Earth's surface rather than horizontally and facing the sky to allow easier movement between the panels. And of course, solar installations are a natural addition to greenhouse roofs. Co-location affords a number of benefits, specifically to crops and livestock as well. So beneath the solar panels, less moisture evaporates. Temperatures are moderated with cooler daytime temperatures and warmer nighttime temperatures, resulting in protection from both heat waves and frost. And of course, some crops require partial shade, so they're a natural pairing with solar panels. And livestock and apiaries also benefit from access to shade. And then beyond shade, solar installations can be a sturdy structure to provide security from extreme elements like heavy rain and hail that can damage sensitive crops like grapes and berries and such. And then believe it or not, there's actually benefits to the solar panels themselves. It's quite the symbiotic relationship. Growing crops in an agrivoltaic system is actually good for the panels because it helps them keep cooler too. And this in turn makes them more efficient. Solar panels lose efficiency when they get too hot. Additionally, the vegetative ground cover reduces dust that accumulates on solar panels and then subsequently reduces the solar panels' productivity. So less dust means more productive panels. The vegetative ground cover also, particularly deeply rooted vegetation, stabilizes the ground for stormwater control purposes. And then in addition to like livestock grazing or crop production, the more traditional ag practices of agrivoltaics, there's also some agricultural conservation practices that co-locate well with renewable energy. The three types of ag conservation practices in particular are worth noting. One is native grassland restoration. There's also long-term cover crops to improve soil quality, and pollinator habitats. Now, all of these plant-based conservation practices have similar benefits in terms of cooling the panels, lowering dust accumulation, and are contributing to stormwater control. But in addition, wild pollinator habitats have measurable impacts to nearby crop yields, and native grasses often have deep root systems that counteract soil compaction associated primarily associated as being problematic with the installation of solar. For more context, there's a couple of studies I'd like to briefly share to highlight the benefits of collocation. The US Department of Energy's National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL, has been around for about 15 years now. And in one study, researchers planted 3 common crops, 2 types of peppers and cherry tomatoes. And for the 3-month growing season, monitored light levels, air temperature, and relative humidity using sensors just above and below the soil surface for crops placed within an agrivoltaic system and crops placed in open sun. Solar panels without the crop undergrowth were also measured. And several results were noteworthy for the agrivoltaic systems. One of the peppers produced 3 times the fruit, the tomato doubled fruit production, water use efficiency for the crops improved in various ways, and the solar panels in the agrivoltaic system were cooler during the day by approximately 9 degrees Celsius, allowing for better performance. And then another study, a 2021 study in Minnesota on pollinator habitats associated with solar facilities, also had some promising results. So pollinator habitat was seeded with a native mix under installations on 4 different solar developments in Minnesota, and compared to pollinator habitat nearby, but not under solar panels. And surveys were conducted during the summer months to document habitat condition, like the variety of flower types and flower density, and then also to document the use of these areas by insect pollinators. And while there's much more to this particular study than I'm sharing now, some of the interesting findings included that a higher number of monarch eggs and larvae were observed on plants under the panels. Immature monarchs were observed more commonly under the panels, and the number of mature monarchs observed were significantly higher under the panels. As a butterfly fan, I found this really exciting. So not to steal any of Jesse's thunder, I know he has a lot to share on how all of this translates to planning policy for the renewables locating on Aglins, but I did want to share that Minnesota has a really neat resource called the Solar Site Pollinator Habitat Assessment Form for Project Planning. And I want to make sure to share that resource. I'll place that in the comments and pass the torch. I'll put that in the comments now and pass the torch back to Jesse.
Thanks, Whitney. Before you pass the torch totally to me, I'll put you on the spot a little bit. We had a question about whether you have any examples of where this dual use has been successful. So do you have some examples of particular locations?
Well, let's see. A lot of the studies that are older have been, I'm not exactly, well, the first study I shared, and maybe the question came in before I shared the studies, but the US Department of Energy's study, I'm not exactly sure where that was located, but that involved solar with peppers and tomatoes. And then the Minnesota study, or the study on pollinator habitats, occurred in Minnesota. Most of the studies, older studies, are overseas, and some of the greatest successes seem to, that I've noted in research, and I'm still in the middle phases of research at this point, were with crops that need some sort of canopy regardless, because the fruit itself is like grapes or berries. It's just more sensitive to harmful weather. And so there's the canopies would ordinarily be provided. I forget exactly which country though that was in, but in terms of pairing between solar and a particular crop, that one seems to be particularly beneficial.
Yeah, a lot of this is in Europe initially, right? So they're way ahead of us at this point. Yeah, and somebody asked about a link to the paper that we've been talking about. Either Whitney might be able to do that while she's not on the screen, or I can do that at a later point. Well, while I'm sharing my screen, you already saw a problem that I had with that. So, but we will get that link to you guys so that you can look at that. Also, Joe Lurch shared a really, sounds very exciting, that the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality is thinking about a process where they would link local weather radar and use that to determine when the panels can be placed in a vertical position so that all of the rainfall will go into the ground instead of into impervious surfaces. So that sounds really exciting. We are making a lot of advances in this, and a lot of it, like Whitney said, a lot of it we're still working on it, and Europe has been a leader in this. So now let's talk about some things that might be more directly applicable to land use planners. So we did this initial study where we produced the paper, and now we're doing phase 2 of the study, which is looking at co-location more and looking at local planning and zoning practices. So the first study, we looked at what can we do to better link the agriculture and renewable energy. And for you GIS people out there, you're going to be really excited. Melissa and others are excited because the number one thing that we saw is that you have to do mapping. Mapping is really important, and it's more than just mapping prime farmland soils. The best example that we found is Hawaii. So that would be exciting to do a field trip. Maybe we can do a mobile workshop on this, but they have just such a wonderful GIS system on this. And what they look at prime farmland soils, but they look at other categories of agricultural soils as well and map them. They also look at where are the wind turbines and solar panels right now today. They map where do we have potential, the best potential for wind energy and for solar energy, and what areas are not particularly promising for wind and solar. And where do we have transmission lines and other utility infrastructure, which is important in connecting to the grid. And look at, what are the trends for where agriculture is trending or converting into renewable energy production. And, where are our ag lands being lost to development or other pressures? And so they take all of this data and they map it, and it provides a very rich resource when they're looking at where should we encourage future wind and solar generation, and where should we perhaps protect the farmland production. And so mapping was number one and very important. The Hawaii materials are cited in the paper that we will link to everybody so that you can go look at that. Really fun just to look at what they've done there. Involve agricultural leaders in the renewable decision making. So when you have your committee or planning commission or whoever's making this decision, make sure that you include the agricultural community so that they can have a voice and they can have a seat at the table when these decisions are being made. They can often provide some unique perspectives and valuable information. Protect the problem soils. That seems to come up over and over. Instead of just saying blanket protect farmland, or let's just turn it all into renewable energy, you need to prioritize. And the number one way that it seems like people are prioritizing is those prime farmland soils, which really can't be replaced. And they're where they are and we can't move them around. So that's an important consideration. Really think about the benefits of dual use or agrivoltaics. And when I start talking about zoning provisions, a number of local governments have put this into place and are implementing this either through encouraging dual use or in some cases requiring dual use if you're going to put renewable energy production on agricultural land. And finally, and I'm going to talk about this as well, is planning for decommissioning. This is similar in my mind to telecommunication towers and other infrastructure of that sort, where at the very beginning, you have to put in steps that when those wind turbines or solar panels are no longer in use, who is responsible for removing that? And who's going to pay for it? And what are the requirements? And I'll talk about that more as I talk about particular zoning provisions that I've seen in practice. So, okay, here we go. And I know Melissa and perhaps others of you out there want me to write your zoning ordinance for you. And I'd be happy to do that in some ways, but Whitney and I were just talking about this last night, that this research is really exciting. We're having so much fun doing this, but on the other hand, there is so much to this. And so what I'm going to do for the next 15 minutes or so is to tell you I've reviewed quite a few ordinances, looked at some model ordinances. There are some model ordinances cited in our paper. And here's what I keep seeing. And here are some of the lessons or some of the things that people look at. Before I get into particulars, let me give you some general notes. First of all, as Whitney said, a number of states have now, primarily based on NIMBY opposition, where local citizens have opposed every renewable energy proposal. And the local governments have kind of accommodated that and denied a lot of these projects. A number of state governments have stepped in and said, okay, local governments, we will make the decision. And so the first thing you have to do in your particular state is to look at state law and see whether local governments have been preempted with respect to renewable energy. If they have been preempted, to what extent have they been preempted? This is a big issue right now, for example, in Maryland. There are a lot of interesting wind cases in Maryland and solar as well, where there is some state preemption, but the courts, unfortunately, are put in the position of trying to say, what authority does the local government have, and what authority has the state taken from the local government and reserved for themselves? So the first thing you have to do is say, okay, what is the situation in my state in that respect? So the second thing I want to say is that when we did our research to try to find ordinances, the first thing that jumped out at me is, wow, there's a lot of ordinances from Michigan. And Whitney has also seen a lot from Michigan. It seems like, and I don't know if there's anybody from Michigan here with us today, but Michigan has really thought about this. And so they've connected agriculture and renewable energy. And so when we did our search, a lot of Michigan ordinances popped up. The second thing I noticed is that a lot of the ordinances that I reviewed are municipal ordinances, which is kind of strange in a way, because you would think agriculture and renewable energy, that seems to be more of a rural issue. And I'm speculating, but I think, let's look at my home state of West Virginia. There are probably 5 to 8 counties out of our 55 counties that have zoning. So a lot of rural areas don't have zoning. Secondly, you look in rural areas, and even where they have zoning, due to a lack of resources, there's also a lack of capacity. So their ordinances just might not be as up to date or as detailed as other ordinances. And I think this is a big issue. I was involved in a wind turbine case in Iowa. And that's where I said, well, it's not just West Virginia. In Iowa as well, in the county that we were working in, their zoning ordinance really wasn't clear about wind turbines. And so I think a lot of communities just really need to look at this. So I took what I could find, and I found a lot. And I think these are at least give everybody a good starting point for what kind of things do I need to look at when I'm drawing up my solar ordinance or my wind ordinance. Now, some of the considerations cut across solar and wind, but there are also differences. So I tried to separate them a little bit here. And the other, I'm going to, before I get into particulars, a few other things. A lot of the ordinances that I looked at, wind and solar facilities, particularly bigger facilities, were only allowed in agricultural zones, rural residential zones, and industrial zones. So that tells me that farmland is in the bullseye. That's where these facilities are allowed. A lot of the ordinances required underground utilities, and that the operator provide proof that they've been approved to connect to the grid. In more residential settings, a lot of the solar and wind facilities were not allowed in the front yard, only allowed in the backyard. So let's talk about some of the considerations. First thing to distinguish is on-site versus utility scale. and I'm talking about solar now. And the number that I kept seeing as far as the dividing line between on-site and utility scale was 10 kilowatt hours. I don't know why that's been used, but that's a number that I've been seeing. As far as limiting on-site, a lot of the ordinances say it can only provide power for on-site uses, or some of the ordinances said we'll let you produce 125% of the on-site use. Another consideration is the wind or solar a principal use, or is it an accessory use? So you've got your solar panels on a residential dwelling versus your wind farm or your solar farm. And those two are obviously going to be regulated differently. A lot of communities, I would say close to 100% of the ordinances that I saw, the large solar and wind facilities were conditional uses. I want to give a word of caution on conditional uses. I see a lot of local governments who make a lot of uses conditional on the belief that we retain control and we retain discretion. And that's a very dangerous thing to do. Conditional uses, you have to have the criteria in the zoning ordinance, and the BZA has to be limited by those criteria. So be careful. Certainly it makes sense to make large facilities a conditional use, but put your criteria in there. Setbacks and visual barriers. Again, I looked at mostly municipal ordinances. The setbacks that I saw were generally about 50 feet from the road or boundary line, and I saw some 75 feet setbacks from a inhabited residence. And there was also a lot of focus on screening, and that's from both the public right-of-way and from neighboring properties. And I can tell you, when I drive through New Mexico and Arizona, I go by some very large solar facilities, and it's very disconcerting. So I can see where screening is necessary. So they often talk about if it's a smaller type thing that's on a house, it has to blend into the architecture of the building. Otherwise, it has to be screened from the public right of way. And often they specify that evergreen vegetation or native vegetation be used for that screening. In a related issue for light and glare, mostly that is stated as that the light has to be directed away from and shielded from adjacent properties and the public right of way. And the glare cannot affect driving visibility and glare should not be projected on neighboring properties as well. And that's a huge issue. The ones that I've drove by, they obviously didn't have those provisions. Noise is an issue. And the number that I saw was 65 adjusted decibels. And that's measured from the property line. I also saw some ordinances that just said they referred to their noise ordinance. So that's two types of way to address the noise issue with solar. Whitney mentioned lot coverage and vegetation. is really important, and like Whitney said, is mutually beneficial. It's beneficial in a lot of ways for solar panels that be vegetated beneath the panels. And most of the ordinances I looked at required that there be vegetation below the solar panels. And if it wasn't vegetated with grass or other types of native vegetation, then the solar panels counted towards your lot coverage provisions. And that means it's not going to qualify. So basically, they're requiring that you have vegetation or grass cover. Collocation. Some communities, some, just a few, are requiring that if you locate on prime farmland, you must co-locate. Others say if you locate on any type of farmland, you must co-locate. Other provisions encourage co-location. There are a number of performance standards. Stormwater is a big issue, and mostly it says that the stormwater cannot affect adjoining properties. Lighting, I've already talked about. Glare, connected with stormwater, there are erosion controls, and they are often stated as performance standards. For height of the freestanding or ground mounted solar facilities, for the most part, my general range was for small facilities 10 feet high, for larger ones 15 feet high. I saw the biggest that I saw was 20 feet high when oriented at maximum tilt. So that's the range that I've seen there. Next, very, very important, decommissioning. Most of the ordinances that I looked at were very smart by saying that 12-month abandonment period generally, most of them require that everything be removed and that the ground be returned to the way that it was. And most of the ordinances, very smart, require bonds or some type of other financial assurance so that those facilities would be decommissioned when no longer in use. And I'm going to go through the WIN pretty quickly so that we can have time for questions. A lot of these are the same, but different. Like height, for example, 100 feet was common. And that was when the turbine, the blade of the turbine was vertical. It could be a maximum of 100 feet. Setbacks, really important. The minimum setback I saw was equivalent to the height of the turbine. But many ordinances say height plus because of debris issues. And then a lot of ordinances say 1.5 times height from an inhabited dwelling unit. So the setback's really important, obviously, if there's a catastrophic event where the wind turbine falls down. With wind and with solar to a degree, they required a building permit for smaller wind turbines. They required a site plan for larger facilities. And it seemed like 30 feet was a common break point for building permit versus site plan. Noise, again, a lot of times they refer to the local noise ordinance. It's important when you're doing noise ordinance, and Whitney and I will talk about this in November when we talk about zoning in the Second Amendment. When you have to make sure you keep you treat different uses similarly. So a lot of them refer to the local noise ordinance. Ground clearance, I've seen half of height, and I've seen 20 feet for smaller facilities. Minimum lot sizes are all over the place, from 1 acre to 5 acres to 10 acres to 20 acres. But that's a consideration. Really important, signs. Most of the ordinances for solar and wind say the only signs that you can have are FAA signs or manufacturer signs. You can't advertise on these things for obvious reasons. For wind turbines, no artificial lighting at all, except what is required by the FAA. A lot of ordinances require shadow flicker analysis. Decommissioning is very important. And then finally, and this is a provision that I've encouraged our communities to use in a number of circumstances. And yes, I get a lot of pushback, but I think it's very important. Liability insurance. There are a number of ordinances that require that the operator carry sufficient liability insurance, whatever that number is, in case there is an accident. I could go on for a lot longer, but I see that we only have 5 minutes left. So I will stop there to see what questions that we have. And I don't know if you have looked at questions, Whitney, or if you would like me to look at some of the questions.
One, I think you would be well suited to answer paper. In the paper, I think we talked about a bit of this occurring in California. So the question is, has there been any thought or policy papers prepared as to how reduced agricultural assessments could be impacted by, and it says, for example, land use in Virginia, especially with dual use or co-location. So I think the question's getting at, there are different tax benefits or financial incentives for ag, to the extent ag converts to renewable energy. What are the consequences we've seen, or what papers have we found?
That's a great question. I haven't found any papers at this point, but I know that a number of states provide real property tax incentives for renewable energy as well as agriculture. And it's New Jersey. I did see where New Jersey has specifically said in the state code that wind turbines and solar panels are agriculture. And therefore, if you have wind turbines or solar panels on your property, you still qualify.
And where was it, Jesse, where there was a county by county difference in interpreting, in one state, there was a county by county difference in interpreting the continuance of an ag financial benefit. Was that California?
Yes. In California, they have the Williamson Act, which is a special act for ag land protection. And there was a big division within the state as to whether putting wind turbines or solar panels on the property meant that it no longer qualified for farmland protection. I'll also say conservation easements is another area where we have a big divide between, if I have a conservation easement on my property, can I put solar panels? Can I put wind turbines? That's also an area that has some controversy.
And then another thing I can add is we're currently looking into whether some of the conservation incentives through, I think it's CRS and EQIP, are available to farms that are going to co-locate ag conservation practices with renewables. We don't have an answer yet, but we're looking into it. Another question, Jesse, is does West Virginia have policies or incentives to direct solar or wind facilities to abandon mining sites in order to reduce pressure on the use of ag lands?
That's a great question as well. And actually, I think Melissa is on the webinar, but there was a report put out by the Energy Center at WVU, which is encouraging renewable energy. And there was some concern about what impact that would have on farmland. But there was also an earlier report that they looked at where they looked at the amount of abandoned mine lands and things like that that we have in West Virginia, which are also relatively flat and could be used for solar and wind. So there are in West Virginia and other places some incentives and encouragement to locate wind and solar on land that's otherwise not being used, or not, was formerly in use and now there are some issues. So great question. And I'm now going to put in the chat the link to our paper. Any other burning questions there, Whitney, or any of the participants want to? Another great question, how does co-location affect the ability to access crop insurance? We should add that to our list, Whitney. That's a great question.
I haven't heard of instances where wind turbines are co-located with telecommunications, but that's definitely a neat concept for rural access to better cell coverage and even broadband.
And then there's another great question about the link between co-location and the Endangered Species Act. Wow, thank you guys. There's like 5 new law review articles we can write out of this. And those are great questions. And I think they're questions that at this point have not been explored in any depth. So things that we need to look at. Well, we are a little past 1 o'clock. I'll turn it over to Jillian and see how she would like to proceed at this point.
Thanks, Jesse. We are at 1 o'clock and we do want to respect people's time, but if the speakers have 1 or 2 more minutes just to answer a few questions while others are still on, feel free to do so. The recording will be shared to YouTube, and then also if the speakers are comfortable with it, we will share your emails with attendees in the email follow-up afterwards if there's any burning questions that are not able to be answered. But if you'd like to take a minute or 2 more, that is perfectly fine.
I'm looking through the questions. There's some more great questions. American Solar Grazing Association, we will definitely look at that resource. Thank you for that. Apologize for the use of the NIMBY term that might not really encapsulate a lot of people who are opposed to these policies.
Yeah, I think I would just add that the NIMBY term is mostly just a planning term that encapsulates the complexities of people maybe wanting certain things, but not wanting them close to them. But of course, as planners, that's the job. But I don't necessarily think it's a name calling term, but rather just a term that encapsulates the difficulties of making projects happen.
Any final words, Whitney?
Just that there's this is all ag and renewables have definitely been intersecting for some time now, but it definitely seems like the time is right for the planning to start to get into high gear at the state level and the local level. And I think that if we plan well on the front end, we can set these projects up to do a whole lot of good.
Yeah, and I'll just, for those of you in West Virginia, the West Virginia Solar Summit is on August 24th in Hardy County. I'm not sure if that's open to the public or not, but I know that there are a lot of discussions going on everywhere. Thank you all for your very thoughtful questions and input. Sorry that we aren't able to answer all of the questions, but we will continue to work on this, and we welcome any feedback or input that you have.
Thank you all. An email follow-up will be going out shortly, and don't forget to check out the YouTube for the recording later. Thank you.